Hi, and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. We also have our live events on there too, if you're in the Portland area and want to check those out. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Clyde W. Ford talking about his new book of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth. Clyde W. Ford is the award-winning author of 13 books of fiction and nonfiction, having received such awards as the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award in African American Fiction, the prestigious Washington Center for the Book Award, and the Nautilus Book Award in Social Justice. He is also the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Publishing Project at HarperCollins and has participated in hundreds of media interviews with appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Show, New Dimensions Radio, and NPR. In his provocative, timely, and painstakingly researched new book of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth, Clyde W. Ford tells the story of how Black labor helped to create and sustain the wealth of the white 1% throughout American history. Ford uses the lives of individual Black men and women as a lens to explore the role they have played in creating American institutions of power and wealth in agriculture, politics, law enforcement, culture, medicine, financial services, and many other fields, while not being allowed to participate fully or share in the rewards. Of Blood and Sweat is a compelling look at the past that holds broad implications for the present day calls for racial equality, racial justice, and the abolishment of systemic racism, and offers invaluable insight into our understanding of Black history and the story of America. In this evening's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a particular question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Clyde and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy of Blood and Sweat will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight, as well as his other books. Clyde, we're so thrilled to have you with us, and just thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Nick, and it's always a pleasure to be here at Powell's. Just want to give a shout out to some of my friends who I see have joined us. One of my friends, Ross Taylor. Boy, I've known Ross for almost 60 years. That really dates us, man. Jolie Spar, thank you for joining as well, too. I feel like I'm at home. I lived in Portland for a number of years. I love being down in Portland. And, you know, that corner on Burnside where Powell is, I mean, hey, what a better place in the world. There isn't. And that the bookstore is an icon every time I'm in Portland. And I mean, every time I stop in. There's just something about walking through Powell's, and I think it's because there aren't that many bookstores like that anymore, and just wonderful to do that. So always love coming back to Powell's to speak. I'm glad I could do this virtually. I wish I could have done it in person as I did the last time, but thank you all for being here, for joining us, and Powell's for hosting me. Really appreciate that. I thought a great place to start would be for me to read a little selection from the book so that you could get a sense of not only what the book's about, but also how I chose to try to write this book. And then we'll talk about it a little bit more, and we'll see where we go from there. So I'm going to read from chapter 1, right from the beginning of chapter 1, actually. And I think that's just a great place to start. Anthony Negro and Isabel Negro is how they were known in the 1625 ledger of Captain William Tucker of Elizabeth City, Virginia. In all likelihood, they also had African names only the ages now know. They may have been baptized shortly after birth, and their anglicized names conferred then by Portuguese priests who ventured deep into the interior of Angola, where Catholicism was well established by the late 16th century. Or Portuguese priests may have performed obligatory baptisms and christenings of these two young people as they were herded into the hold of the St. John the Baptist, a Portuguese slave ship at anchor in Luanda Bay off the coast of Angola in the late Central African rainy season of 1619. Let's call them Anthony and Isabella for the purposes of our narrative. Two among the 20 and odd Negroes Sir John Rolfe recorded aboard the Dutch man-of-war White Lion, lying at anchor on August 20th, 1619, at the mouth of the James River off of Point Comfort. Anthony and Isabella carried within them the germinal seeds of the first Black child that would be born in America. So on that fateful day in August 1619, they probably did not know that, nor did they know they would name him William. Nor could they have known that symbolically they also carried within them the germinal cells of Scipio and Crispus and Nat and Sojourner and Maggie and Frederick and Booker T and W.E.B. and Marcus and Langston and Duke and Yardbird and Train and Malcolm and Martin and Rosa and Barack and Trayvon and Eric and Breonna and George and me. And countless millions who in some measure or part were torn like them from Africa's soil. Anthony and Isabella stepped from the decks of the White Lion into a pinnace, bobbing into the surf off of Point Comfort, Virginia, a small boat that would carry them to the white planters and merchants and colonists waiting ashore, men who had just determined their worth in terms of salted meat and vegetables and grain and the other provisions needed by the captain of the White Lion. What they did not know then, could not have known then, is that in being handed over to these men, they were about to embark on a journey of unimaginably epic proportions, a heroic journey in which during their lives, they would endure great hardships and privations, a symbolic journey that would see their work lay the foundation of the economics, politics, religion, medicine, education, industry, law enforcement, and technology of a new nation. And a hard-earned journey that would generate great power and wealth for some that sadly, Anthony and Isabella and those like them would, for the most part, never share. In their interaction with those white men ashore lay the embryonic maps of many roads, some surveyed and taken, others surveyed and deemed unworthy. American slavery, American freedom, Bacon's Rebellion, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Cotton Gin, the Age of Sail, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, railroads, mines, oil drilling, cars, lynchings, Red Summer, 2 world wars, 2 marches on Washington, the murders of Malcolm and Martin, the gunning down of Trayvon and Ahmaud, the killing of George Floyd, and the many other events shaped by the interaction of Black folks and white folks here in America. Anthony and Isabella did not know this then, and neither did the men ashore like Captain William Tucker, who would acquire and settle the couple to work on his plantation near present-day Hampton, Virginia. But today, we can know what became of those seeds, real and symbolic, which Anthony and Isabella carried within them. We can know of the roads taken and those that were not, and where they could not know, we must not forget. Thank you. That's just a short selection from the beginning of the book. And, a couple of things are important about that selection for me. One is I really tried to tell this story, not as a set of dry historical facts with statistics and maps and all of that other stuff, but really as a personal story of individuals who lived during the time period covered by the book. And the book roughly covers time period between 1619, actually pre-colonial. So in pre-colonial Africa through 1880 in the United States. One of the questions that I get frequently on the book, I got it on Good Morning America when I was there, I was just on the Michael Medved show, which was very interesting, conservative talk radio host that I actually had a great time with. Michael asked tough questions, and I love tough questions and the opportunity to engage in a dialogue. But one of the questions I get frequently is, did you write this book as a rejoinder, as a response to critical race theory? And I have to say, I do smile a little bit when I hear that question for two reasons. One, because I wrote the book a long time ago, before critical race theory was even a big deal. Most people don't understand it takes a fairly long amount of time to go from a manuscript to actually, a printed volume. It doesn't just happen overnight. And I think it was really the wisdom of my editor, Tracy Sherrod at HarperCollins, who decided to hold up. I couldn't figure why Tracy wouldn't release the book, because she had it early. But I think she knew something that I didn't, and she knew there was going to be a right time to release this book. And oh my God, it's amazing in terms of when it hits, because of all of the things that have happened in popular discourse, which we'll talk about. But one of the things that's going on, I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, is a lot of what I consider to be foolishness, craziness, insanity around this question of critical race theory. Couldn't believe that Florida actually banned 54 mathematics books because Ron DeSantis and his cronies thought that somehow they had something to do with critical race theory. Look, I just want to say this before we start. I want to give you a sense of what critical race theory is, and more importantly, what it isn't, because I'd be the first to say that my book is not a book about critical race theory. The name should tell you everything. Critical race theory is a theory. It was started as a legal theory in 1977 at Harvard University by Derek Bell and a group of Harvard scholars and lawyers then. A theory is a way of looking at facts. And if we're talking about a historical theory, a theory is a way of looking at historical truths. The problem that has happened right now in this country, in the banning of books and the banning of mathematics books now, which is just insanity, is that people have confused facts with theory. A set of facts is a set of facts, and historically, they're things that happen. And a theory is how you look at what things have happened. So my book really is an opportunity to present to the reader, to present to you, my reading of the facts of American history that we often do not get an opportunity to hear in grade school. Now, as it turns out, a lot of those facts tend to support the tenets of critical race theory, but there's a really big difference between theory and facts. And I look at what's going on in Florida and laugh, really. I mean, it's sad. I mean, I laugh and I'm also just amazed because, most people should have learned the difference between theory and facts. If they didn't learn it in their history classes and other places, they should have learned it in math, because that's what 10th grade geometry is all about, separating theorems from facts. But again, I would say that many of the people who are yelling and screaming about critical race theory, and the former President Trump, who's telling his throng of supporters to lay down their lives opposed to critical race theory, have no clue what they're doing or what they're talking about. But let me tell you some of the historical facts that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know. Those opposed to critical race theory, for example, don't want you to know that Columbus and the so-called explorers did not leave Portugal and Spain and England with this prime directive like you hear of on Star Trek, where you're just going to visit other cultures and it's going to be this wonderful, magnanimous, auspicious occasion for you to enlighten yourself about other cultures. Columbus and the men like da Gama and others who left, Magellan, who left Spain and Portugal, left under a prime directive given to them by the King of Portugal, and more importantly, blessed in a manifest and a papal bull by Nicholas V, who was Pope. That was brutal. And I actually give a copy of that manifest It has a Latin name, dum diversus, which simply means until I change my mind, essentially, the meaning until the Pope changes his mind. And that manifest said that those explorers were granted God's authority to rape, kill, savage, enslave, and burn to the ground any culture they came into contact with that stood in their way of accomplishing two things: the establishment of Christianity and the taking of wealth. And so Columbus came really to the New World with this idea that what was here was his for the taking. And his idea was also, and he's very clear about this in his writings, that he was going to enslave the native population that was here. And I'm telling you this for a specific reason, which I'll get to in a moment. It has everything to do about enslavement in America. What Columbus did not figure on was that he was not only bringing the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria and all of its crew, but he was bringing a pandemics really, or epidemics of disease from Europe. Smallpox, and last time I looked up, some 27 or 28 different diseases. So here's what's happened. Columbus arrived off present-day Hispaniola, that's the islands which have both the Dominican Republic and Haiti on them. There was a group of native people there, the Arawak, sometimes called the Taino, 1 million at least by conservative estimates. Within 10 years after Columbus's arrival, because of disease, pandemics, that million figure dropped down to 15,000. Wow, 15,000. So really, Columbus and the other explorers who had gone south to Central America and South America were kind of in a jam. We were like, wait a minute, we want to pillage and rape this and steal all the resources, but we don't have anybody to work the plantations and the mines. And so, and again, it's not me saying this, it's other scholars saying the reason that Europe turned to Africa as a source of enslaved workers was that their first option failed. And the first option was to enslave natives who were here in the Americas, who did not have immunity to European-bred diseases, where many Africans, because of the close contact now for almost 100 years by the time of Columbus's arrival, had some level of immunity to European diseases. So that's a fact that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know. And I think the other important fact that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know, or another one, not just the other one, but another one, is that 1619 doesn't mark the beginning of slavery in the United States. Wow. That's a big thing to say, because it's not only people opposed to critical race theory, but I think also a lot of well-meaning people, Black and white, think that slavery in the United States started in 1619. Let me disabuse you of that notion in this way. Anthony and Isabella did not step off of the White Lion into a pinnace, they call it a dinghy, it would be another word for that, and get rowed to shore. And the white guy standing on shore said, well, we got this whole system of slavery. We're just waiting for these Africans to arrive so we can lay it on them. That is not the way it happened. And to say that slavery started in 1619 is to miss one of the most important aspects of American history. And that is, how did this country get from, in pre-colonial times, the kind of society that existed when Anthony and Isabella did step on shore, to 60 years later being a country of chattel slavery? It is in that process, which I write about in the first several chapters, that I think we find some very telling and often very sad moments in the early history of what became the foundation of this country, where you see so clearly, for example, that the laws in this country were architected in order to support the economics that made some folks wealthy. I'll just give you one short example of that. And that example would be this. In 1656, there was a woman named Elizabeth Key. I write about Elizabeth in the book. Interestingly enough, one of her descendants is, believe it or not, Johnny Depp. And Elizabeth Key was held for several years, actually almost a decade, in enslavement. She didn't think she ought to be held in that condition, so she sued. And interestingly enough, 1656, she won. And she won for two reasons. She won her freedom. One, she won because her father was an Englishman who was free. And based on English law at the time, you were to be considered free or not free based on the condition of your father. That was one reason the court cited. The second reason was she was baptized. And because she was baptized, law and common practice had it that Christians should not and could not, or shouldn't at least, enslave other Christians. Well, 1656, within the next 10 years, Maryland and Virginia passed laws that say, oh, forget about the legal system that came over from Europe. We're going to establish our own, came over from England. And in our legal system, your condition follows the status of the mother, not the father. And forget about all that stuff about, Christians can't enslave other Christians. It doesn't matter what your religious status is. If we decide that you're a slave because you're from Africa, that's it. It's a clear example of how a legal system developed in order to support an economic system, when in fact that early legal system had nothing to do with that. Another fact, really, of history, because you can read about it again. I cite a number of the laws that took place in that process. Another fact that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know is that the founding fathers, the founders, were great debtors. Jefferson died July 4th, 1826, $2 million in debt by today's standards. I'm not saying this. I'm not making it up. I simply went to the history books. I went to Jefferson's estate, and you can find that information right there. In fact, you can even find his son auctioning off his possessions. And what is perhaps more important, a lot of people know that Jefferson, Washington, Madison were slave owners. But what a lot of people don't know, and I think is perhaps even more damning than just enslaving other people, is that Jefferson tried to get out from under his great debt by using those he enslaved as collateral. And so in the book and also on the website, I show a copy on the website in Jefferson's handwriting. For anybody who might dispute this, it's Jefferson writing to his creditors in England and in Amsterdam saying, look, I know I owe you guys a lot of money. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pledge, and he lists by name the men and women he held enslaved and said, I'm going to pledge them as collateral. And one can trace back this idea then of holding African descendants as collateral for debt right through to the early banks in this country, to the insurance system that insured the collateral that was being pledged. And it is both a horrid, but also, I think, an important fact of the history of this country that a lot of people just don't want you to know. They would rather you have the kind of beautiful, mythic sense that, George Washington got in trouble for chopping down a cherry tree, and Thomas Jefferson was this wonderful thinker of lofty ideals about liberty, eternity, and equality. It's a lot more than that. In fact, one of the things that I found most interesting through the book, in writing the book, was this idea that without bondage, that is, without holding people enslaved, the founders would never have had the time to consider these lofty ideals of freedom and liberty and eternity and equality. This was actually a theory put forth by the late Edmund S. Morgan of Yale University, who said, very simply, in the United States, what we see throughout history is that freedom is predicated on bondage. Wow, it's a short statement, but it's deep, because you ask yourself, now exactly what does he mean there? And here's what Morgan meant. The founders, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all of the Southern founders were plantation owners. And what crop did they grow? They grew tobacco. Tobacco was the first cash crop in the United States. Tobacco, and I go through the steps of what it takes to grow tobacco. And I did that in the book because tobacco is a really demanding mistress. I mean, you got to plant seeds in a big, quantity, and then you prune some of those small shoots and you put them in other mounds, and then they grow to a certain height, and you got to cut off the flower so it doesn't flower, and then the leaves get big, and you've got to make sure you cut the leaves just at the right time. You let them dry for a while outside, then you put them inside a curing barn, and then you have to roll them right, and you have to pack them in barrels. I mean, we're talking about a very time-consuming, labor-intensive process. And what Morgan was saying is that if the founders, if Jefferson and Washington and Madison had to spend the time that it takes to actually farm, if they were actually there doing the farming, they wouldn't have had any time to pontificate about liberty, eternity, or fraternity, and equality. And that's why Morgan was to say, in the United States, you see that the freedom of some is predicated on the bondage of others. And to be quite honest, when I was thinking about the first stages of the pandemic we were in, I also thought about Morgan because we had designated certain people, often they were folks of color, who were essential workers. And what we really were doing there was a repeat of what had gone on in earlier times, where some people were enslaved, and really, and I say enslaved in this sense, there was a virus, and these folks were still out there going to work every day. Why? To provide the essential services that other folks of privilege could use. I just found that incredible. And I said, once again, here is Morgan really coming through with this theory that in the United States, freedom of some is predicated on the bondage of many. Another idea that just, those opposed to things like critical race theory, they don't want you to know because it is upsetting and troubling. For example, an idea that really comes through, and I think we see it particularly with this upcoming holiday, Juneteenth. And I have to say, personally, I don't celebrate Juneteenth. I probably never will, and I won't for the following reason. Juneteenth, the popular version, is this holiday, which I actually call the celebration of Black ignorance, because in the popular version of Juneteenth, those poor, dumb, ignorant Black folks who were enslaved didn't know that they were free, and they needed a Union General Granger in order to go out to Galveston Island to tell them they were free. That is not what happened. Granger wasn't there to talk to the Black folks about the fact that they were no longer to be held as slaves. Granger was there to lay down the law with the white folks who were holding those Black folks enslaved and tell them, hey, y'all lost the war, and now in the peace, you can no longer hold other people enslaved. That's the part that no one talks about. That's the part that I think really needs to be supported, along with the idea, and this I also found very surprising. If you read the Emancipation Proclamation really, really closely and clearly, Lincoln did not free one slave under his control. The Emancipation Proclamation issues a proclamation that slaves in the Confederacy are to be free. Well, the Confederacy never recognized Lincoln's authority anyway. So after the proclamation, if you were in Mississippi, the proclamation granted you freedom. But if you were in Massachusetts, you could still be enslaved. In fact, it wasn't until 1911 or 1913, I can't remember the date, I think it was 1911, that slavery in Delaware was actually on the books outlawed. So the idea that the emancipation freed Black folks, that June 19th was a celebration of that freedom because finally the last Black folks heard about that, a lot of that is, it's a lot of nonsense historically. It's not how it took place. And on the heels of that, one of the other things that folks don't want you to know, that I wrote about in a recent Seattle Times op-ed that actually generated a lot of heat, which I think is great, because it's an important discussion to have happen, is that Lincoln, after issuing the Emancipation, really had no plans for what to do with the 4 million folks that he had just freed under this order. And it's interesting, I find it really interesting, because the Confederacy actually had a plan in place. Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of the State for the South, actually had a plan in place for what to do with the formerly enslaved if the South won the war. And Benjamin's plan, just to make it short, I talk about it more in the book, actually was, well, what we'll do is we won't grant them full citizenship. We'll kind of grant them this halfway status. They'll kind of be like serfs or peons. I think he actually used the phrase peonage, which means, you know, they're kind of be really tied to whatever our whims and fantasies are. And so I say in the book, and I've said it a number of times, the North may have won the war, but the South really won in terms of what was done with freed, formerly enslaved. What happened, and this is important for the discussion on reparations, and that's why I'm going to bring this next idea of what people just don't want you to know about American history, is that one of Lincoln's generals, General Sherman, did have a plan, or developed a plan in consultation with the key African-American leaders of the time. The plan was called Special Field Orders 15. Some people know it as its popular name, 40 Acres and a Mule. And that plan was that the North winning the war would basically take away from Southern white slave owners. First, it was 400,000 acres of land. Then it was an additional 500,000. So almost 1 million acres of land, 900,000 acres of land, and redistribute it to the formerly enslaved. I give a map, that landmass is well known. I have a map of that on the website of bloodandsweat.com. You can see where it is. It's coastal land, very rich, fertile coastal land from northern Florida up to about the middle, or maybe the little bit higher in South Carolina. So a wide tract of land. The Freedmen's Bureau was established. Otis Oliver Howard, a general in the Civil War, whom Howard University was named after, began distributing that land. 40,000 formerly enslaved families got grants of that land as reparations for the time they spent enslaved. And then Lincoln was assassinated. And one of the first things that Andrew Johnson did in stepping into office was to rescind Special Orders 15, to basically tell all of those 40,000 families, sorry, but we gave you that land and now we're taking it back. And there's this really poignant moment when General Howard is on Edisto Island in South Carolina, trying to deliver the news that this land now that he just granted, he's going to have to take away. And the reports of the day are that in the back of the crowd where he's speaking, an old Gullah woman, and Gullah is the culture of the Sea Islands, breaks out in a song, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Had, which is the Georgia version, Sea Islands version of that song. And the reports are that upon hearing that, Howard broke down and just wept because he recognized what he was doing. Now, a lot of people, and it's what I say in my op-ed on reparations, when we talk about reparations, they're like, hey, I might even be for reparations, but where do we start? Or they'll say, I wasn't even involved, my family wasn't involved, we came well after slavery, so we shouldn't have anything to do with reparations. Look, the United States has granted reparations in other instances. And in my op-ed for the Seattle Times, I talk about the United States granting reparations for the Japanese citizens that had interned, in Washington State actually being ahead of that process and actually having on the books right now a law that says that reparations, at least for these Japanese citizens, were just and right and fair. I think the same should and could be done for those folks who have really suffered from the effects of being enslaved. And just a couple of weeks ago in California, the California Task Force on Reparations made a very, I think, important, difficult decision that yes, reparations were in order, and if reparations were to be given, then they would be given on the basis of people being able to demonstrate that genealogically they descended from those who had been enslaved. Hey, That decision was debated hotly. I think debate is an important thing to have, and they finally did vote on it, and that's the decision they got. I think we ought to go back to 1865 and say, we promised this group of people land, we took back our promise, and we want to instill that again. I don't think the land needs to be redistributed, but I think it's pretty clear what that land is. Again, the map is available, and I know that economists can tell us what that land is worth in today's value. To me, that's a great place to start in a discussion on reparations. That's the figure. You tell me how many trillions of dollars that land is worth now, and that's the amount of money we need to be discussing in terms of reparations. Do reparations mean you write a check? Maybe, but not necessarily. There's lots of ways to consider how reparations is actually fulfilled. It could be a check, it could be tax credits, it could be college tuition. I mean, the ways of potentially engaging in the process of delivering that reparation should be up to discussion, but whether it should be delivered and how do we actually compute a figure, I think there's some really good roadmaps for that. But that's another thing that those opposed to critical race theory don't want you to know about the history of this country. And the last thing I want to say before I open up the floor to questions is this. A lot of times people will ask me, well, you know, it seems like this book is really divisive because you're saying things that could be controversial and, you know, some people don't like it. And isn't it the wrong message to deliver about something in this divisive way? And my response is always this. I'm a huge believer in truth and reconciliation. A lot of you remember that the late Desmond Tutu ran the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. South Africa is certainly not a perfect society, but Desmond Tutu was at least trying to find a way forward for Black and white South Africans beyond the trauma and the horrendous nature of apartheid, when so many or too many white South Africans visited violence and death and really horrible things to Black South Africans. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, also implemented a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in terms of the horrid things that were done to the Indigenous Canadian population. And we're still finding out about this. You know, every month we hear something else, like the fact that the Catholic Church was deeply involved in the brutality of residential schools, the Indian residential school system. And I was really pleased to hear that the Pope had at least apologized to some degree for that. Truth and reconciliation. Here's what a lot of folks don't want to discuss and don't want you to think about. You don't get to the reconciliation until you get to the truth. And my book is really about the truth of American history, so we can then get to the reconciliation around the racial wealth gap, around racial equity, around reparations, and issues like that. Truth comes before reconciliation. Once you can deal with the truth, then you can talk about reconciliation. So, in a nutshell, that's the book. I'm pleased to have the opportunity now to entertain any questions that you might have. Nick, if you want to jump back on and see if we've got any questions, and if we don't, well, as I'm sure you could guess, I'm fine to go off talking a little bit more. I think you're muted, Nick, because we can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. I got it. Thanks for that. So I do have one question so far.
Sure.
So, to all those else, please, yeah, this is a great time to ask your questions. We'd love to, so take that opportunity, use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and just ask your question. We'll start here from Ross Taylor asks, can you talk about the origins of the current police and justice system?
Thanks, Ross, my good buddy. As I said, I've known Ross for almost 60 years. So when I wrote that chapter, and Ross, I have to tell you, it's really important, this story. I'm going to tell you how I came about that chapter, which I've never said to anyone else. So I was driving down to visit a friend in Portland, and I was actually listening to one of the history books. I don't remember which one it was, that was about the era and the origins of policing. And I tell you, I almost got into an accident because it would just amaze me what they were saying. So let me say this. Something bothered me, really bothered me, other than the fact that Derek Chauvin snuffed out the life of George Ford. Something bothered me about the iconography of that moment. And by that, I mean the iconography is Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. And I kept saying to myself as I was writing this chapter, I've seen this image. I've seen this image. Where have I seen this image before? And first I thought, well, maybe it's just a common thing you see in police brutality. And then it finally dawned on me that the place I had seen it was in pictorial descriptions of the Old Testament. And I actually talk about that image and show the image on the website of bloodandsweat.com, where one of the kings in the Old Testament actually has another king, most likely a king from south of the Sahara, maybe Egypt. And the first king, has his foot on the neck of that king. And I thought, wow, there is the iconography. The iconography for the violence against people to whom you feel superior has deep biblical roots. And Ross, I don't have the quotes in the Bible at my fingertips, but I do give them in the book, where you can actually go back to the Bible and find those quotes about it's okay to step on somebody's neck. It is sanctioned by at least the God of the Old Testament. And any of you who know the difference between the Old and New Testament will know that the Old Testament's a pretty darn violent book. So that got me thinking, whoa, I know that Black Lives Matter folks take the idea of police brutality back to the slave patrols, but I have a feeling it's much deeper than that. And that feeling got me to investigate further and further and further back to the origins of policing that came over in this country from England. And what you start to see when you do a book like this very quickly is you start to see, and it's pretty much an obvious statement, colonial America didn't just happen. Colonial America happened because Europeans wanted it to happen, and they brought with them not only their greed and avarice, but also the laws and culture and ideas. And one of the ideas they brought over was an idea about how you police. And those ideas for policing actually originate in England, as I describe in the book, in the 13th century. And again, I'm not saying this. I mean, I went to modern day policing manuals and textbooks, and they say, and I listened to criminologists who actually said, yeah, the origins of policing in the United States and to some degree in Canada can be traced back to something called the Statute of Winchester, 1285. And in that book, in that law, that edict rather, that was issued by Edward I of England, the Statute of Winchester, it describes how to do policing. And you know what's so bizarre? We still use many of the same terms today that were used in the Statute of Winchester, like a watch controller, watch officer, or like dividing a city up into wards. All of those were terms and ideas that came to us from the Statute of Winchester. Now, you take this very, very, aggressive way of policing. Basically, the Statute of Winchester defines us and them. And the us are the people that do the policing, and the them are anybody who are not like us that we have the authority to control and throw in jail overnight. All of this stuff that the statute says. You take that kind of a statute and you transport it now 300 years later to colonial Virginia, as Virginia is starting to establish a system of chattel slavery. And who is the us and who is the them? Well, the us is the white planters and sometimes the white indentured servants, and the them are the Africans and Native Americans, and those are the folks who are then patrolled based on these old ancient ideas about how you do policing. So yes, you can trace back modern day policing to slave patrols, and I actually show the pledge that slave patrollers took, how the badges even look the same, but it goes even deeper in that. And I think it was when I understood how deep this idea about us versus them policing, how deep that was, I began to change my views about whether it's really possible to reform policing. My feeling now, I started the chapter thinking, well, police reform is a pretty good idea. I ended the chapter thinking it's not possible to reform it. It needs to be displaced and a new system of policing started from the ground up. There is no other institution in our country that is based on 750-year-old ideas. Why should policing be? I think there are some models for how to do that. I'm thinking of a couple of cities in Oregon even that, have, I think, better models for policing, maybe even the country of Norway, better model for policing. There's lots of things that could be done, but I do think it's not about throwing more money and more military-grade equipment at police departments and hoping that that will help them change. It's about rethinking how we do policing and law enforcement and imprisonment from the ground up. And everything, at least that I wrote about in that chapter, shows that. I think the last thing I would say, Ross, to answer your question, is that even goes directly to the heart of the Second Amendment, which a lot of people will cite as somehow being this the icon of that Americans can own guns and kill people at mass shootings whenever they want. It's not true. That's not how the Second Amendment came about. I talk about it in the book. I went back to the actual debates between the North and the South. And one thing was clear, 100% clear, is that the use of that term militia was understood by both Northern and Southern delegates as meaning a code word for slave patrols. So the Second Amendment and 25% of the Constitution actually is the North appeasing the South around the issue of slavery, and that has then creeped into the love affair that Americans have with guns, in the sense that they ain't going to give up their guns. It doesn't matter how many people die, how young they are, how wide a mass shooting is. The Constitution says I can own my guns. Well, that's not what the Constitution says. It's what we've wanted it to say, and it's what some people have misinterpreted the Constitution as saying. Thanks for that question, Morris. I apologize for such a long and winding answer to it.
So we do have another question here. We have another question from Jolie Spar, asks this question. And Jolie asks, if we can reduce the book to a thought or action that your readers should consider, what might that be?
Wow. Thanks, Jolie. I appreciate that question. I appreciate it because I have to think on for a moment, at least, on my feet about what that would be if we could reduce the book. And I think if we could reduce the book, maybe I've really said it. I said it earlier when I said, I think the most important aspect of this book is that it tries to tell the truth so that the truth can be a platform for reconciliation. I really believe that we have in this country the opportunity to reconcile around some of the really tough, hard issues in terms of race that we've never as a country addressed. But if we're going to get there, we've got to tell the truth about what actually happened. And so that, I think, is the main message of the book. Look truth in the face if you want to get beyond that truth to reconciliation. So again, thanks for that question. And just as a short example of how important that is, President Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Bill about 2 or 3 weeks ago. That bill actually was first suggested to President McKinley by Ida B. Wells in 1898. And it's taken that long for the Congress to actually vote on it. It came up 200 some odd times in the Congress, and it was voted down. Just the simple idea of a bill against lynching, making it a federal hate crime. I'm really pleased that Biden was able to sign it, but I think it is, again, an example of how we need to tell the truth about our history so we can begin to take the steps that will bring us closer towards reconciliation. Thanks, Jolie, for that question.
So we have no other questions at the moment, but there's still time. So if you have one, please go in there and do it. Write it in our Q&A box there, and we'd love to, I'd love to ask it, and Clyde would love to answer it, I'm sure. So,
that's fine. And as I said before, I'm never at a loss for words. So
that sounds good. Yeah, I mean,
listening. Powell asked me if I needed or wanted a conversationalist for this evening, and I said, don't worry. I'm from New York City. One of the things we know in New York City is how to talk, right?
Absolutely.
And I think if I was going to jump back into this whole idea of what it is about critical race theory that many people don't want you to know, and maybe some of the things I did not have time to say, the one that comes up most readily in my mind, and maybe one that might surprise you, is I don't think that those opposed to critical race theory want you to think about the relationship between technology and oppression. And this is just a fascinating subject that I say fascinating because so many of us are relying on technology. And of course, I'm talking now about the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century. So there's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's no telephones, there's no cars. But still, the technology of the day was used as the basis of Europeans being able to exploit Africans. Let me give you a great example of that. The early sailing ships were flat-bottom ships. I'm a sailor, and sailors call those kinds of ships. They didn't sail well into the wind. They only sailed well with the wind behind them. We call those ships pigs because they don't sail into the wind very well. So early Europeans, now we're talking about before Columbus and Da Gama and Magellan, could sail these ships with the prevailing trade wind south pretty well, and get to various parts of the West African coast, and they did, and they captured individuals. They also captured various raw materials. But now to try to get back to Europe, they have to make a maneuver which sailors know it's attack. They have to attack, and that means they have to kind of go somewhat in the wrong direction in order to catch the wind that can take them back in the right direction. And they had to tack almost as far west as the eastern shore of South America to catch the trade winds to give them a ride back to England. Well, a group of a group of Dutch nautical engineers working out of the Dutch city of Hoorn came up with a novel design. Again, we're talking the 1500s, a novel design for a new ship called a flout, F-L-U-I-T, and I give examples of that. Every one of the major ships that the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the Mayflower, the ships, the Susan Comfort that came over to start the colony in Virginia, they were flouts. And the interesting thing about flouts is that they were deep bottom, deep draft. They could sail both with the wind, and they could sail pretty well against the wind as well too. I think something like 45 degrees against the wind, which is pretty good, maybe a little bit more of an angle than that. And because of that, that new technology then allowed Europeans to be more proactive in the way that they raided both the human and natural resources in Africa. And it's a pattern that I've described in this book, and also, interestingly enough, in my book, Think Black, of where technology, right from the beginning, has often been on the wrong side of human rights. And so that's another thing that I think people don't often think of. They think of technology as just being wonderful and beneficial, and aren't we glad we've got all this great technology? Look, Early computer technology was used to support eugenics. Eugenics is that horrible science of race which says there are some people who are worthy, white, Northern Europeans, and some people who are not. Eugenics is not an idea of the past. Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and many others saw that as the basis of their immigration policy. Early computers supported eugenics research. IBM, as I describe in Think Black, was deeply involved in the Holocaust, was deeply involved in apartheid, and even today with facial recognition. These companies are involved in how can they get technology to discriminate based on race so that governments and those in power can use that information in order to segregate out some people from others. So it's a long history of technology being on the wrong side of human rights and social justice. And that's another thing. Again, I tried to trace some of the roots of that in my book, that I think those who are opposed to critical race theory do not want you to think about, because it brings up really, really troubling issues, even about how technology is used today. So I don't know where we are in terms of time, Nick. How are we doing?
We've got about 3 minutes left. And so, it's, yeah, if you have, if you have some last stuff you want to say, then feel free. I mean, we're, not in any rush here. So, yeah, maybe.
Well, I'll say this. I also get the question, for me personally as an author, what's next? And I've already spec'd out a volume 2 and a volume 3 of this series. I don't want to give away too much about volume 2, other than to say that I'm looking forward to getting into the writing of volume 2, because it starts where volume 1 leaves off. So volume 1 ends in 1880 with a speech, a fairly not well-known speech by Frederick Douglass in Elmira, New York. And volume 2 picks up, of all places, at Mahatma Gandhi's ashram in Gujarat, India. And again, this is all focused on the role of Black folks in creating, that's volume 1, and then challenging, that's volume 2, white power and wealth. So I'm looking forward to that. I love the opportunity to write a book like this, primarily because I get to learn so much. And I go into a book with these open questions, and I like to read and research, first to answer those questions for myself, and secondly, to present to the reader a roadmap where they can contemplate these questions and come up with their own answers as well. Now, that's one of the reasons that why this first volume of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth has over 600 references. I wanted to make sure that anyone who wanted to follow up on what I wrote about could do so and recognize that I didn't just come up with these ideas on my own, but I actually did the research to support that. And it's also why I put on my website many of the original documents that I use in order to write these various chapters of the book. So, the website of bloodandsweat.com is organized chapter by chapter. And for each chapter, there's 3 things that I think are unique. One, you can read my notes about that chapter, what I was thinking about in writing that chapter. 2, any geographical place in that chapter you can fly into using a 3-dimensional globe, and it's kind of a cool feature. If you want to actually see where the Rapidan River is, you can fly into the river. If you want to see where the Elmina Slave Castle is in the west coast of Africa, you can fly in with a 3-dimensional globe into that. And the last thing is I've got supplemental sources that I use so you can actually see, as I said earlier, in Jefferson's handwriting, Jefferson writing a note using his enslaved folks as collateral. You can see some of the documents that came out of some of the, the early movements against to suppress the Black vote in this country. And I probably have, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 different references with copies, images in that case. So for those of you who are further interested, I encourage you to check out the book's website of bloodandsweat.com. It's got a lot of, I think, cool stuff on it.
Excellent.
And with that, I think we are due. And I want to say thank you to Nick and the Powells and for all of you who have joined us tonight for this opportunity to share a little bit about the book with you. There's a lot more to it than I've actually had the opportunity or time to speak to you about. If it piques your interest, Powell's has a copy of the books. I've sent Powell's autographed book plates, so you can get those autographed book plates, and it's not the same as me signing a book there, but it's the next best thing. Thanks again. Have a nice evening. Stay safe.
All right, yeah, and thank you so much, Clyde. Thanks, yeah, and thanks for that great presentation. And thank you everyone for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you at another event sometime near in the future. So, all right, thanks so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night now.
Bye. Good night.